Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band podcast. I am your host, Benedikt, and I'm here with my friend and co-host, Malcolm owen-flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Hello, I'm great, man. Just had an amazing week out in the bush doing some filming. I got so wet. It was literally just pouring the entire time, all day, every day. And I had a poncho and a rain jacket on under that poncho, and all my clothes under it was still wet. It was crazy.
Any new floods in your house?
No, my house did good. I actually didn't really hear about flooding elsewhere, but it doesn't mean it didn't happen. So somehow, it just seems like the weather was blown out of proportion this time. But who knows? Maybe it's just on its way.
Yeah. Okay.
How are you, man?
Good to hear nothing happened. It was amazing. It was my wife's birthday yesterday. So we had it wasn't the big party because of the Corona stuff still, but we celebrated for sure. And it was a great weekend. We have snow now. It started to snow this weekend. So I was out with the kids playing in the snow. So it was really, nice weekend.
Oh, that's really fun.
What's also fun is that for the first time in years, I completely ignored Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and all of that.
Wow.
The only thing I bought was a course that we both talked about before we started recording.
Too.
Yeah, that's the only thing. The one you bought is actually not even a Black Friday deal, but the other one was one, I think. And I bought it, but not because of Black Friday. That just seemed to happen. But I ignored it completely. I didn't buy a single plugin, not a single piece of gear, nothing this year. I just spent time with the family and just decided to ignore it. And that was actually great.
Yeah. You know what? I am proud to say that I have not bought a single plugin either.
Cool.
Very stoked. Awesome. It's hard. Last year, I bought 5 or something.
Yeah.
Went nuts. So it did good. I'm proud of us both. And this is right after recording an episode called You Need to Stop Buying Gear.
Yeah.
So that worked. We were late on our audience because our audience is listening to that episode after Black Friday, but we recorded that just in time for ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, really, absolutely. I might have bought something, but maybe. But after that episode, I was like, no, I'm not going to buy anything this year. And also what I did last year paid off because last year I switched all of most of my monthly subscriptions and stuff like that to annual deals. And I caught all of the Black Friday deals last year just to save on those recurring expenses that I have anyways in my business. So that was a smart move. It was a ton of money up front last year, but it saved me a lot of money during this year. And all of that stuff got renewed now, and I still have the same deals. So that really paid off. And that was the only thing I did on Black Friday. No, not the only thing. I bought a bunch of things last year, but that was the main thing that was really a good decision. And this year I didn't have to do anything. So
fantastic. All right. We're winning.
Winning
is off to a good start.
Yes. So what did you want to say before I...
Oh, no, that was what I wanted to say. I wanted to ask how you did with Black Friday after doing an episode about not buying gear. So, great. Fantastic.
Yeah, sure. Now, before we dive into today's episode, I want to ask you something. I want to ask you for 2 things. The first thing is we said that in the last couple of episodes, and I want to say it again. If you get something out of this show, please go to your podcast app, preferably Apple Podcasts or iTunes, and leave us a review there, please. Share it with your friends, first of all, and then go to your podcast app and leave us a review. That really helps us a lot. And just do it, and we'll be forever grateful. Thank you for that. And the other thing I wanted to talk about is, in case you haven't heard of it, you probably have, but in case you haven't heard of it, I'm doing coaching now. So if you want a coaching call, a completely free coaching call to discover whether or not we would be the program would be a great fit for you, and if you just want to have a free coaching session for an hour and get clarity on what to focus on next, get a personalized roadmap, get some action steps, get some feedback on your recordings, you can go to theselfrecordingband.com/call and just fill out a little form and book a free coaching call with me. And during that call, we'll dive deep into your music. We'll figure out what your biggest pain points are at the moment, the problems you need to solve, what your goals are, what you really want to do with your music, how you can get there. And you will leave this call with much more clarity and a pretty detailed roadmap and action steps that you can follow with or without me. Anyway, this will be really valuable. And if you want to do that, theselfrecordingband.com/call. Hope to see you there.
Do it.
Yeah. Do it. So, all right. with that out of the way, we start today's episode, and we talk about something. I'm curious how this episode will go, actually, because there's so much we could talk about when it comes to this topic. We talk about elastic audio. That basically means stretching or compressing an audio file, and compressing in the sense of like compressing the time, the length of it. Like, yeah.
Not the quality. Yeah.
Not the quality. Yeah. So we talk about manipulating audio so that what you recorded gets longer or shorter, essentially.
Yes.
And you can use that to correct timing issues. You can use that to sync up multiple recordings if you're doing doubles or layers of stuff. There are multiple use cases. Mm-hmm. And I think that most people with a modern DAW have already started playing around with that, probably because most DAWs do have a feature like that. But there's a lot of confusion and a lot of mystery about it as well, and a lot of things that can go wrong. And we want to talk about that today. We want to tell you why you would want to use something like that. We want to give you some use cases where it's a good idea, where we think it's a good idea to use elastic audio. We also want to talk about situations where it's probably not a good idea, or you should try slip editing first, like cutting, moving, and then putting the audio back together. And we're going to talk about all that, and we'll just try to demystify that whole part of editing a little bit, because we really think we need to talk about it. It's confusing, for sure. It can be confusing.
Yeah, definitely. So, like you just mentioned, slip editing. There's kind of two primary forms of editing. There's slip editing, which is where you just chop the audio file and move it to where you want it, and then crossfade it back together, right? And that is 99% of the time what I use for everything. At least 98, if not 99% of the time. And that's what I think is usually, like, I think that's what most people should do. I think they should be slip editing whenever possible, as much as possible, because it's usually very transparent. And if your takes are good, there's no reason it shouldn't work. Now,
did you just say when you sorry to cut you off, but did you just say when your cakes are good?
No, if your cakes are good, your takes will be good as well. Yeah. But no, I meant to say takes if I didn't say takes.
You probably did, but I heard cakes. Might be still in birthday mode. I don't know.
Yeah, that's right. What are you thinking about over there? If you have good takes, slip editing is generally totally possible and usable, and is what I recommend and what most pros that I know do. The reason I wanted to do this episode in the first place, though, was that a lot of people that are getting started, when I encounter how they've edited something, say I get something to mix, I hear it. I hear that they've used Elastic Audio for all their editing, or I'm talking to them and they're like, oh, I just figured out how to use Elastic Audio, so I'm doing all my editing now. And alarm bells start going off in my head, pretty much. And it's, I wonder if this is the same for you, Benny, but most of the time, these people that get caught up with using time stretching as their main editing tool are Logic users, because Logic and GarageBand are like really built around that and not built around slip editing. I actually have never been able to figure out how to slip edit in Logic. It drives me nuts. I just can't figure it out.
Yeah, I agree. I tend to agree. Even like they implemented it very early. Like even when I remember in 2009 or so, I was on Logic 9. It wasn't even Logic Pro X. It was Logic Pro 9. I was still on Logic back then. And I used the flex time thing all the time. They had it as part of their DAW, even like 12, 13 years ago. Mm-hmm. And it worked. And I didn't really know the difference. I knew it, but I wasn't really sure. And I think I just couldn't get slip editing to work well as well, because flex time was so easy in Logic. You just detected the transients and then you quantized the drums or whatever, and it would just move those flex markers around. And it kept the phase relationship and everything, and it just worked. And I never really thought about what was actually going on, but like it was stretching and compressing the audio versus like what Beat Detective does. Yeah, Beat Detective can do elastic audio as well, but like when you slip edit stuff, it makes a cut on wherever the transients are or wherever you want to do a cut, and then you move the slice to where it's supposed to be, and then you close the gaps again. And you can do that with stretching or with just crossfades. And like, yeah, it's hard to explain on a podcast without showing it what I actually mean. But like, you know what I want to say. Like you can, if you make a cut and you move one, like you have a piece of audio and you cut it in half or in two pieces, and then you move the pieces where they are supposed to be, you probably have a gap somewhere and you have to close that gap. And slip editing means you just grab the end of your event or your clip or whatever it's called in your DAW, and you drag it so that the the gap is closed, and you make a crossfade. That means a very short part of your audio will happen twice, because you just moved it and then you close the gap again. So there will be a very short repeated thing, which is usually not audible if the gap is short enough.
Yeah.
If the gap gets too long and this technique doesn't work because you get the transient twice or whatever, then you can stretch it, and that closes the gap without this overlap or this double thing that happens, basically. Yeah. And that's what flex time did without showing it. It's the weird thing about Logic, at least it was back then, that it would show the flex markers and it would show the corrected result, but you didn't really see where the cuts are, whether or not it's crossfades or stretched, or I wasn't really sure what was going on under the hood. And that always made me a little nervous. And so I prefer just to know what's going on, but
Definitely. Yeah. So the advantage of slip editing is that it there is that really few samples of duplicated sound that happen twice, like you said, and they're crossfaded together, and we don't perceive that if it's done well. And usually that's placed in a pretty quiet spot, right before transient. There's probably not another transient, so there's a little opportunity of silence, more or less, to crossfade together. So the advantage is that other than that little fade, our audio is totally unchanged, right? It just happens sooner or later because we've nudged that clip that way or one way or the other. Where with elastic audio, once you've stretched it, you've changed the entire clip, right? Whatever part has been stretched, that whole audio file is now different. You might not be able to tell, and that's great. If we can trust our ears with this stuff. If we can't tell that it sounds worse, that's totally awesome. But something has happened. There's no way you can stretch or compress the timing of an audio file without it doing something to the sound. It has to. So slip editing is transparent. That's why we normally use it. But elastic audio, pretty darn convenient and incredibly powerful for what it can do if you're in a sticky situation. And I do want to say that, our opinion is slip editing. There's totally people that are really good at what they do and have bigger records under their belt than we do that use slip editing probably. I don't know who they are. I can't think of anybody, but I'm sure they're out there. I'm sure, some Juno winning guy, or Juno's pretty niche, that's Canadian, I think, but the other one,
the Grammy,
some Grammy winning guys just only using elastic audio and just saving so much time because they're just auto quantizing shit and they don't care what we say. But anyways, you should know the difference, and that's why we want to talk about it.
I actually think most people use a combination of both, to be really honest. I think that I don't think that a lot of people only use slip editing or only use elastic audio, because there are situations where one is better than the other. And definitely. So, I can't think of a situation where I would only use, there are situations where I would only use one, but I can't think of ever not using one or the other. I don't know.
Yeah, I get through entire projects without using it all the time, for sure.
Without elastic audio, you mean? Yeah, for sure. But that's the same. I probably worded that wrong. That's the same for me. I just don't think that I could limit myself to only do slip editing forever. There are projects where I need elastic audio. So and I don't think there are people who just don't do one of those ever.
Yeah,
I just don't think that's
and that's not what we want to do here. We want to teach you how to use elastic audio well and when to use it. We want to add it to your tool belt as the tool is meant to be. And I'm just suggesting that you also look into slip editing, so it's not that it's not the opposite. We don't want elastic audio to be your only tool either.
Yeah, totally. No, I get it. Yeah, absolutely. So let's maybe start with explaining real quick, what are the situations where you use elastic audio most of the time, and are there situations where you don't use? What are the situations where you don't use it ever?
Right. I guess there's two situations. The one is when it is a disaster. When there's a disaster that I can't fix with slip editing. So a good example would be a really rushed fast drum fill. Say that there's a snare roll. Da, 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 da. If those are all rushing and getting closer and closer together, and there's just no way to pull that back onto beat one at the end of it, they just went da, 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 and then there's this big pause, and then they come back in on one. We have to try and slow that roll down to make it happen, so that the song stays in time. And you could try slip editing, where you chop at each transient and nudge them all around. But what happens is that when you try and roll back the clip to connect with all the gaps you just made and fade it together, you encounter the snare hit before or after. There's not enough space to make this happen. And there are clever ways to get around that for another episode with duplicating silences and stuff, but it's honestly just such a pain in the ass and it's not worth it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't always sound good. It's usually not worth it. So that's like the prime example where Elastic Audio is just a lifesaver, where you can just mark all your transients and stretch those hits to be longer and fill that space. And you won't encounter these double transients. And it just works. It just works. There's still stuff we're going to talk about in this episode of how to make it sound really natural, because there's different algorithms. That's the clue. Different algorithms for different sounds. But that would be my first use case, is like fixing performance issues that just cannot be corrected with slip editing. And then my second most common one is aligning stuff like backing vocals. When it is something like a vocal double where it is very in the background, not in the focus of the song, I am not afraid to butcher it however I need to. I don't care if there's artifacts happening if I can't hear them, So if I need to line them up to the lead vocal, I'm going to use Elastic Audio just to shift them around like crazy.
Sure. Yeah, agreed. Same.
Yeah. So those are my two main use cases. Do you have like another one that you use it for often?
Yeah, I think I just view it a little differently. I do the same, but I want to add something, and that is with drums, I try to avoid it, but that might be because I use Cubase, or we use Cubase here, like Thomas and I, the engineer who works with me at the studio, who does a lot of the editing for me. He's also the amazing human who edits this podcast, by the way.
Yeah, shout out to Thomas.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. We played around with that quite a bit, and we had some situations on different records where we got away with like little to no artifacts on drums, and others had like audible artifacts that really bothered us, and we wanted to figure out why, and why it was sometimes so hard to get rid of those artifacts or to avoid them at all. And we found that sometimes what you just described with stretching a roll or something on drums can work very well, especially if it's just a short thing that you need to stretch. But sometimes, and that might just be a Cubase problem, if it's longer parts, or even in some situations, if it's just a roll, it says it keeps the phase relationship intact, but it actually doesn't. So you can group the tracks in Cubase and you can edit them together, and it should stay in phase. And it always stays in phase when you slip edit, but with stretching, it just sometimes doesn't work. And we don't really hear that a lot on the transients, interestingly, but we hear it on the cymbals. So sometimes we have this weird, like sometimes we hear it on the transients as well, but most of the time we hear it in the cymbal decay. It sounds like an MP3. It has weird phasing problems going on when there's a cymbal bleed through that roll or something. For whatever reason, Cubase sometimes has a hard time stretching these things and keeping the phase intact with drums. So I try to stay away from stretching if possible, or Elastic Audio in total if possible in Cubase. I know that I never had these problems in Logic, and I also believe, and that might be wrong, but I'm going to say it, I also believe that I didn't have these problems in previous Cubase versions, which is a little weird, and I'm probably wrong, but I've done it that way like forever and never really had a major problem. And since a year ago or so, we encountered these problems, and it might just be that I got more sensitive to the artifacts, and most people don't even hear that maybe. But it might also be that somehow Cubase changed the way it works. I don't know. That could be totally wrong. But I just know that it started to bother me more and more, and now we try to stay away from it with drums. In Logic, I think it worked with the flex time thing. And then, yeah, so what I most of the time do, like I do the same thing as you said with the backing vocals or aligning things. I use time stretching there all the time, and I don't care about artifacts even, like just as you said, if I wanted to have it really tight. There is this auto align tool in Cubase, which is similar to Vocaline, or what's the other one called?
Voice Pro.
Yeah, it's the similar thing built into Cubase where you select one clip as a reference, and then you select the other one that you want to align to it, and then you hit align, and it auto aligns it. So that's really neat. And you can choose in Cubase between. So if you don't check any box, it just does whatever is necessary to make it tight. But there is a box that says avoid stretching. And if you do that, it just slip edits, it cuts and tries to make it without stretching.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, but I don't use that a lot. So I just let it stretch or compress whatever it needs to do, and it works very well. So to me, like single mic things, like one track. That's where I stretch and compress all the time, and it usually works just fine. With multi-mic things, I'm just careful about the phase.
Yeah.
Also,
you really got to listen. Really got to listen.
Yeah. Also, the longer the sustain of something is, or the longer the note is, the more careful I am. So, for example, if I added the timing of a bass, sometimes stretching is really cool or even necessary, because if a note is just not long enough, and no matter how you move it around and close the gaps, you always hear the spot where you cut, and you just need to make that note longer. Stretching it a little bit is no problem usually. But if you need to stretch a whole lot of it, or if the note itself, like the clip itself, is really long and you stretch it, sometimes it gets weird. With distorted stuff, even weirder than with clean stuff sometimes, I think. Like, you can do that with DIs pretty well, but once it runs through an amp, it gets a little more difficult in my experience.
I agree.
So what I sometimes do is I would even just take the last bit of a sustaining note and just stretch that instead of stretching the whole note or chord. And that sometimes does the trick. So I'm just careful with stuff that has a long sustain to it. Can be cymbals, can be a bass note, can be a guitar chord. I just try to make the shortest possible stretch, that I can get away with. Yeah. And that usually works very, very well. Interestingly, with vocals, the most important thing in most mixes, I don't have a lot of problems there. I can stretch and compress the shit out of it, and it usually just works. Really, it works. And so when I do vocal editing, this time stretching and using Elastic Audio in general is what I do most of the time, more so than slip editing, actually. So that might just be me, but it just helps a lot.
Yeah, no, I would agree. It does seem to work. Vocals seem to not slip edit super well, depending on the singer, with their like breath placements and S and how long, like between S's and stuff like that. Sometimes the consonants comes really late or really early, depending on the singer, and that can cause problems with slip editing and with Elastic Audio. But it's a totally valuable skill for Elastic Audio. I agree. Again, though, it's one of those you have to listen. I found that different algorithms sound different for sure. So you might time stretch stuff and not pick up that it's like doing something weird to their consonances, for example, or the top end of their voice. So you really have to be making sure that this does sound good. Yeah. But yeah, powerful tool. I agree on the amp thing. I just want to circle back to that. It's like once it goes through an amp, especially distorted, it's like the information becomes more complex and it struggles with it. Where with a DI, it seems to just work quite well. So if I want something really tight and I've got DIs, I'll totally slip edit or use Elastic Audio to stretch those DIs together and make them really tight and then reamp. And it seems to work great. Yeah.
I think the more harmonically rich the source is, the more difficult it gets for some reason.
So distorted guitars and cymbals.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's one more interesting use case actually that I want to talk about, because that's also something that fascinates me, and I don't know why that is, but it's true. And that is, I said that Cubase has problems with the phase if you like do multi-mic drums and try to stretch them. So that is when you use their standard editing tool. So when you cut the whole, like every microphone at the same spot, and then you grab the end of the clip, use the time stretch tool and just stretch it versus doing slip editing, that's when you can encounter problems with the phase. Funny enough though, I recorded a full-length record earlier this year, like in January. This was my last full production that I did. And we recorded drums for a song, and the band provided me with a list of all the tempos for every song, and everything was planned super well. And like we did everything as how it's done, like exactly the way you should do it. But still, for some reason, an error happened, and the band gave me the wrong BPM for one song, the wrong tempo information. And we tracked the whole song, and we didn't notice. And then we found that it's like 2 BPM too fast or too slow or whatever. And we had to change it because it really worked better with the actual tempo. And also, we just an error happened for whatever reason. So we had to change it. So we had two options: re-record the whole song or use the awesome take that we had and try to make it slower or faster. And we just tried, and we just gave it a shot and wanted to know if we can get away with just stretching it. And instead of like what I would do when I edit drums, like cutting it and then grabbing it and stretching it, I just used the time stretch tool in Cubase. That it's a little different thing. You can mark a clip, and then you can open a menu, and you can type in the original tempo and the tempo you want it to be in, and then it calculates how much it has to be stretched to be at the tempo, whatever. And I did that, and it re-rendered the whole thing, and then it was at the right tempo, and everything was perfect when it comes to phase. So
Right.
for whatever reason, Cubase managed to do that well and perfectly, and we didn't have any artifacts, like nobody would ever notice, and it worked perfectly fine. But when I do it manually, it doesn't work as well.
Okay.
And I don't know why that is.
There you go. Well, that brings up a point on our list here, and I wrote it down as the note is third-party options with Audio Suite, and it doesn't actually necessarily mean third-party, but inside of Pro Tools, anyways, there is Elastic Audio built into the editing window, and then there's this menu called Audio Suite, and it's like individual plugins. All my plugins are duplicated there, but they don't run in real time. You select the audio and you process it, and that sounds like what you did. You selected it all and then processes it with a time compression software. Yeah. And it might have been the same one as what your DAW is using, but it's implemented in a different way somehow. It always seems to work better. I agree.
Yeah.
But it only works in situations that allow it. Like you had to do the whole song, I assume, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I ran into this is the second reason we wanted to do this episode is shout out to a band called Vogue Villains that I'm just finishing a record with. They came to me and they're like, hey, we want to change some tempos in the song, like at 3 different spots. So not the whole song, just like 3 parts of the song. We want to change them to different tempos. I'm like, okay, that sounds like a pain in the ass, but let's see what we can do. How much? And like, I'm expecting, 1 or 2. I've done that as well. It seems to work. And they're like, 8 to 10 down. And just for our listeners, slowing things down is worse than speeding them up because you're making information longer. So it has to create information to fill that space, right? You're adding more file size. Where when you shorten it, it's just compressing the information it already has. So it generally works better to speed things up rather than slow them down. So 8 to like 10 BPM slower is a huge change. It's a really big change. And I was like, oh, damn. Here we go. And it's also just like a nightmare because it depends on your DAW, but in Pro Tools, like there's a lot of, you can really screw things up. I might be working on slowing down a part in the middle of the song and then not realize that I screwed up the entire beginning of the song or something while doing these tempo changes because you have to really make sure that you're just editing just what you're trying to do and then that everything else is still staying on the grid and all that. So big project for me to figure that out. I couldn't use Audio Suite because of that, because I needed my my MIDI map and stuff to still translate. So I had to go into the Elastic Audio depths and try out how to make this all work across all of the instruments other than vocals. So distorted guitars, distorted bass, cymbals and everything, and still make it sound good. And that was a really big challenge, but really fun, and I learned a lot as well. And what I learned, which is one of the things that I really want people to get out of this episode, is how different algorithms sound. So in Pro Tools anyways, there's like 5 different selections. When you turn something into Elastic Audio mode, you actually have to enable Elastic Audio on each track in Pro Tools. Again, on Logic, I think it's just always on. I could be wrong though. You get to select what algorithm. And there's like monophonic, polyphonic, so that's 1 note at a time or 2 notes at a time. Rhythmic, so that's for transient stuff. And then there's one called X speed or something, which is just kind of meant to be like a really high quality, does it all, but is super CPU heavy. And then there's also real time or rendered playback. So you can do all this without it actually changing the audio file, or you can turn it to rendered and it actually will create new audio files based on the changes. And what I found is that by messing with those algorithms, it made a world of difference. It went from unusable to it actually worked in the end. My first instinct, I went through and I just went, bass is monophonic, vocals monophonic, guitars are polyphonic, keys are polyphonic, drums are rhythmic, and did all the changes and sounded awful. Sounded really, really bad. So mostly the cymbals and the drums were just not agreeing. And then I tried messing with, okay, what if I took all my overheads and my rooms and like cymbal mics, the complex ones, and changed them to polyphonic instead of rhythmic. And that worked like a charm. It actually worked really, really fantastically. So I've got transient mode on all my close mics, and then my cymbal heavy ones are polyphonic. And tempo, or like, I don't know if this is a Pro Tools versus Cubase thing, but it seems like our phase alignment worked out perfectly, which is fantastic. There was some other workflow tips I needed, or hacks I needed to kind of piece together. Like you have to split the clip at the beginning and end of the region that you're trying to edit. Otherwise, it'll fix that one spot, but the rest of the song doesn't figure itself out. And these are really complex songs. There's like 18 different tempos in this song. So you have to be like, that was really important, cut them all across the whole thing, do that.
Yep.
Yeah. And then the real time versus render playback made all the difference. I think that's just my computer struggling with real time. There's too much processing, but switched to rendered mode, worked itself out. And then the final like polish and making this really sound good was going to that after I kind of done all the changes. I went to that X mode, like the X speed one, the highest quality one, and committed all the changes, just like a hard render, which took like literally 2 hours. So,
very cool thing to do if the band is in the room.
No, not an option. Literally took forever, but it did sound good and it worked. Awesome. So it was a huge workflow, but it was amazing like how much was possible through all of that. So
that's cool. Exactly why we do this episode, because that like we want to tell you like how it's done and how much goes into like what goes into making this work when you do it professionally. So sometimes it's just not that easy. Sometimes you need to go the extra mile, try a couple of things and take the time to get it right. That's just how it's done. That's the reality. And if one thing doesn't work, don't give up and just try all your options until you find something that works, because there's always a way. And if your DAW can't do it, then maybe there's a third-party option, but there usually is a way. Like I've heard recordings that are so terribly out of time and somehow the person mixing it or editing it made it work. So like as long like you are probably not that terrible that it's like unfixable. So and if it doesn't work instantly, there must be another way. So yes. And the one thing I wanted to ask, what I was thinking all the time, you sort of answered it, but I'm still curious. Like using different algorithms on different tracks of the same thing, like a drum kit, still kept the phase intact, you said.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
It sounded way better than keeping them all the same. So it just was able to figure that information out smoother, I guess. And I should be clear, I'm not saying I couldn't hear a difference. I absolutely could hear a difference. We were grunging things up a little bit, but it was worth it. Like it was worth the feel of that tempo is darn cool. I got to hand it to him. Was it worth like 4 hours of my time in the end? I'm not sure, but
did you cut out the bleed? Like, did you gate or use a lot of samples or whatever? Did you like get rid of the cymbal bleed and the close mics? Because what I'm thinking all the time is, I think I can totally imagine that it works if you treat the cymbals in the rooms differently from the close mics, and the close mics focus on the transients. The other stuff has a lot of sustained information in it, so that makes sense. But I was thinking that the cymbal bleed in the close mics would have to sound differently, or like there would have been some sort of phase problems probably if you treat that differently from the overhead rooms. So I think part of making that work is probably getting rid of the bleed in the close mics, right?
Yeah, I turned off all my gates to do the editing because I wanted to just hear everything. And it was good. It was pretty good. But cool. I turned them back on for sure. The gates are going to be there in the end.
Okay. Yeah. Cool. That's fine.
So it just makes it better kind of thing. So it was, again, it always makes a difference. Like we said, that's the reason I usually avoid Elastic Audio, is because no matter what I do, it changes the sound of it. Yeah. But it was usable, just a lot of work.
Yeah, absolutely.
But amazingly, like there was no other way. There's no way to slip edit a song 8 to 10 beats per minute slower. That's impossible.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I assume it's similar in whatever DAW you're in. Like in Cubase, you have different algorithms. Similar, they are even called the same, like monophonic, polyphonic, whatever. So I think options like that should be in most DAWs. You need to experiment with those if you have those options. One thing that you mentioned that's also interesting is the properly slicing up the clips and selecting the right thing to stretch and stuff. That also applies I think that's really important to mention. So if you want to, let's say you have a vocal performance or let's just talk about a vocal. Let's say you have a vocal performance and the last word of the sentence is just too short and you need to stretch it. Now, I made the mistake of just making a cut after that last word, grabbing it and stretching it, only to find out that now the whole clip before it has been stretched and nothing is in time anymore. So what you have to think and remind yourself about, and you can have that on a checklist or just get used to it, is you have to cut that word out, like before the word and after the word, and then stretch it, and then it will only affect the clip you're stretching.
Yep.
Otherwise, you will stretch everything that's before that. And I sometimes, when I get tired or like after a long session of editing, I just make a cut and stretch things, and I just don't realize that I'm now messing with everything that I just touched. So you have to be really careful there, especially before you commit.
Definitely. Yeah. I'm a big fan of, like, I did a save before I turned on Elastic Audio. I did a save after I had chosen my algorithms. I did a save once I had done my first attempt. I just do a save as description of where the fuck I'm at.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Just like as detailed as possible. It looks hilarious. It's like reading a book, a journal of me trying to figure out how to do these changes effectively.
Yeah.
Step-by-step guide. But it saved my butt. I screwed up big and had to go back a version. So there we go.
Yeah.
Totally worth it.
Yeah.
And there's something to be said, even without, like, not just for Elastic Audio, but when you're editing, thinking of like things as objects, like, okay, I need to work on this vocal sentence. Yeah. Block it off, cut on the start and the end, and now that's the object you're working on. Not the whole song. Don't think global, think small. Yeah. And
little workflow hack there, or a little workflow, but also it saves you CPU power, basically processing power. Sometimes I don't even I don't only do the thing where I cut out that sentence or the word. I sometimes cut it out and then render it, like I create a new audio file in place of that clip that I just cut out. Yeah. It's different in every DAW. In Cubase, you can select it and then hit save as new file or something like that, and then it will render it in place and will replace the old clip. I have a shortcut for that. I just cut it out, hit the shortcut, and then it's a new audio file. So I'm going to get to why I do this. I just explained what that step does. That step creates the single word you just cut out. It takes that and creates a new audio file that's just that word, because usually the single word you see in your DAW is just part of a huge clip that's running in the background, and Cubase or Pro Tools or your DAW just refers to that clip and only shows you that part of it. But every processing you do to that thing usually affects the whole clip in the background. Maybe there's a duplicate, so it doesn't affect the other stuff before it. But usually there's more than just the clip you see, because you can always take that clip and drag it, and make it longer and shorter. And in the background, this information is all there. So long story short, in Cubase, at least, if you apply processing like stretching, or if you use the Vari audio thing that's built into Cubase, it's something like Melodyne where you can pitch shift stuff. It analyzes not only this small piece of audio, but the whole clip, even if it doesn't manipulate the whole clip, but it analyzes the whole clip. And if you do that a bunch of times in your session, there's a whole lot of processing going on in the background that you don't even see. So if you want to just fix a single word, you can cut out that word, render it, and then do the processing and analyze it. And that way Cubase or whatever DAW you're using only uses the processing and all the analyzing on that single very short audio file that it's now referring to. It's just replacing it in the pool of audio files, and that will save you processing power. That's just something I do. Same with, like, as I said, pitch correction and stuff. There's no need to analyze a 3-minute audio file if you only want to pitch up a single word. So
yeah, it's great. Yeah, you'll save a lot of time in the rendering. That's awesome. Yeah, and like I said, sometimes this rendering can take a long time. So if you can make it a shorter clip, that's going to, keep the workflow moving.
Yeah, exactly. And also a beautiful thing is you can, if you messed up and you don't like what you did, you can just delete that little clip, grab the clip before it, drag it over where the short clip was, make it longer, and then you have your original audio again. That's not been affected by what you did. So
totally handy.
Yeah. All right.
You mentioned that you don't like the algorithm currently in Cubase, and I think that's probably totally accurate. For example, Pro Tools has changed its algorithm multiple times, and people have been like, hey, this new one sucks. What's going on? Currently, they actually have added back in the old one, I think. So I've got the option of the different algorithms, and then in my time compression little quick tool, I can actually choose what algorithm it's using for that, even third-party ones, which is pretty cool. So I could buy an improved algorithm and be able to just kind of quickly nudge things around without going into technically Elastic Audio. So that's kind of sweet. But what I want to say is, because these algorithms do change and you're going to have a different version of your DAW a couple years from now, even 6 months from now, if we're honest, than you do now. You should render down your edits once you're satisfied with them. You should absolutely commit them and then turn off Elastic Audio if that's an option in your DAW. And like Pro Tools just runs terribly when Elastic Audio is on. So I always turn it off right after. But you want to commit it so that if you update your session and you go back to the song down the road, that it works. You don't want it to not be able to run or sound different.
Yeah, I agree. I never thought about that, but that's totally accurate. It's the same reason why I print drum samples and don't leave trigger open or whatever. It's yeah, totally. I never thought about it, but you should totally commit the edits. Do a save as or something, as you said, so you can always go back to the unedited version, but have a committed one ready. So when in case it just doesn't work anymore, you can continue working with something that sounds exactly the same.
Yeah. Yeah. You know what? Save as with a new title is such an underused hack that
for sure.
That is so essential. And I'm always blown away when I see a session open that's just the name of the song, no other notes or dates or anything. I'm like, wow, that's ballsy. You're like a cowboy in the Wild West. That's crazy.
Yeah, totally. There's two things you should do. There's the save as with a new title, and then there are situations where that is not enough, and you need to do a full backup of the project where you need to save a new version, including all the audio source files and stuff. Whenever you do something destructive, or whenever, I would just duplicate it and have a complete copy of the whole thing, including the audio files. But for the usual steps along the process, the save as is usually enough. But that's the least you should do. Like, just make one for, I don't know, recording, rough mix, or demo or whatever, before editing, after editing, before time stretch, after time stretch, whatever you do. Like, I don't know, like make save as often as you need, and give them names that are easy to understand, even like easy to understand for a stranger. Like, always try to make it, even if you're the only person working on it, always treat it as if a stranger would have to open the session and know what's going on, I think. So
totally. There you go. Yeah, there's way more to this, but I think that's a really good introduction and to get wrapping your head around when to use it and what to watch out for, because it is super powerful, but it's also just as able to destroy your song as it is to fix it. So you have to be really careful with this stuff.
Totally. I think the last thing we should add is, just in case people are not aware, if you're using something like Melodyne or Auto-Tune in graphic mode or Vari Audio in Cubase, something like that, one of those tools that show you the notes of whatever you're editing as like MIDI notes. It looks like you're editing MIDI notes, basically. It analyzes the audio, shows you the pitch, and you can grab those events or clips that look like MIDI notes, and you can drag them to another note. You usually can not only change the pitch, but you can also change its position, and you can change the length of the note that you're editing. That is applying time stretching or elastic audio. So you might not know that you're doing it, but you're doing it if you're using a program like that. If you in Melodyne grab a single word and you change the pitch or correct the pitch, and then you make it just a little bit longer, you've now stretched it, you've applied some sort of elastic audio to it. So you can't only do that with tools specifically made for that, but it can be built into other tools, and you're using them all the time, maybe without knowing. So
absolutely. Yeah. You were talking about using elastic audio to time stretch your vocals. I now use Melodyne for my vocal tuning and love it. And I've totally adopted using its time stretching, just part of the vocal tuning workflow now. It's just, needs to be a little bit longer. Done. Works great.
Exactly. We do that in Vari Audio and Cubase, but it's the same thing. Yeah. All right. Awesome. Thank you for listening. And
thank you.
See you next week.
We got to be getting close to Christmas with this episode coming out, so I hope you're having some rum and eggnog out there.
Oh, no, not that again. I remember the eggnog from last year, but now I know what it is. At least so.
I broke it out last night and went and picked up some rum and eggnog, so I'm in.
All right. See you next week. Bye.
Bye.